A Tudor marriage could survive an affair without a single argument ever being heard. No screaming in the halls, no scandal before the court, and no dramatic punishment for the woman involved. Instead, the household changed slowly. Fewer letters, fewer invitations, quieter dinners, and a mistress who gradually realized the doors were closing around her. The affair disappeared. The family remained, and silence quietly decided the winner. Tonight, we step inside a Tudor household to see how wives ended dangerous affairs without raising their voices. So, before you feel comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Only if your heart truly wants to. If you do like it, leave a little comment letting me know what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights, adjust the pillow to fit your head, maybe turn on a fan to create a relaxing atmosphere, and let's begin this journey together tonight. If one had stood quietly in the great halls of Tudor England, marriage would not have looked like a matter of love at all. It appeared instead as a careful arrangement of land, titles, and bloodlines, negotiated between families who understood that alliances could secure power more effectively than armies. A wedding joined estates, strengthened political connections, and protected the future of a family name. Affection, when it appeared, was welcome, but it was never the foundation. Among the English nobility, a marriage was often decided long before the bride and groom truly knew one another. Parents, relatives, and advisors weighed every detail with patience and calculation. They examined the value of land, the reputation of families, and the advantage a union might bring at court. The result was less a romantic bond than a structure designed to endure through generations. Within this structure, reputation carried enormous weight. A noble household depended on public respect as much as wealth. The behavior of both husband and wife reflected upon the entire family, shaping how neighbors, allies, and rivals perceived them. A careless scandal could travel quickly through letters to servants, and gossip carried from one estate to another. For that reason, stability mattered far more than personal satisfaction. A marriage that appeared calm and orderly strengthened the image of a household that could be trusted. The absence of conflict suggested discipline, loyalty, and control. In a society that valued hierarchy and tradition, these qualities were more important than emotional happiness. Yet beneath this orderly surface, human nature did not disappear. Desire, boredom, and curiosity moved quietly through noble households, just as they did among ordinary people. Powerful men, especially those who spent time at court or travelled frequently, often found themselves drawn into relationships beyond their marriage. These attachments were not always hidden entirely. Servants noticed unusual letters. Stable boys saw unexpected visitors arriving at dusk. Ladies in waiting exchanged quiet glances when a familiar name appeared in conversation. The household often sensed the truth long before anyone spoke it openly. Still, such affairs were rarely treated as open rebellion against marriage itself. Society understood that powerful men might stray. What mattered was whether the situation threatened the stability of the family. As long as the household continued to function and the appearance of order remained intact, silence usually prevailed. The wife, despite living within strict expectations, held a position that could not easily be replaced. She managed the rhythm of the household, oversaw servants, and ensured the proper upbringing of legitimate children. Her presence represented continuity, something no temporary affection could challenge. Even when a husband formed an attachment elsewhere, the wife remained the center of the family's structure. Legal traditions and church teachings reinforced her role. Property, inheritance, and lineage all depended upon the legitimacy she guaranteed. Without her, the entire foundation of the household would begin to weaken. For this reason, noble women often learned early that patience could be more powerful than confrontation. Open jealousy might damage reputation and invite gossip. A measured calm, by contrast, preserved dignity while allowing circumstances to change naturally over time. In many households, the early signs of an affair were treated not with anger, but with quiet observation. A wife might notice longer absences, unfamiliar names appearing in letters, or subtle changes in her husband's attention. None of these signs required a dramatic response. Instead, daily life continued, much as it always had. Meals were served beneath candlelight. Guests arrived for hunting parties, and letters were written at heavy oak tables. The great houses of Tudor England were built upon routine, and routine often concealed the tensions beneath. Over time, however, even the most discreet arrangements could begin to shift. The excitement that first surrounded an affair rarely lasted forever. Responsibilities returned, political pressures increased, and novelty slowly faded. What had once seemed thrilling could gradually become inconvenient. It was at this quiet turning point that the true structure of Tudor marriage revealed its strength. A husband might wander, but the system surrounding him remained firmly in place. Family alliances, inheritance, and reputation waited patiently in the background, stronger than passing desire. A mistress could enjoy attention and gifts, but she rarely possessed the protections granted by law or church. Her position depended entirely on continued affection, and affection was among the most fragile forces in human life. The wife, by contrast, stood within a framework designed to endure. Many men eventually understood this reality without needing it explained. The world around them reminded them constantly of what was at stake: titles, land, and the future of their children all depended upon maintaining the legitimacy of the household. Within the quiet walls of noble estates, marriages therefore developed a curious resilience. They absorbed secrets, tolerated mistakes, and survived situations that might have shattered other relationships. Appearances mattered more than emotional honesty. To modern eyes, this balance can feel strange. Today, marriage is often imagined as a union built upon personal affection and choice. In Tudor England, however, it functioned more like a political institution, quietly governing family life. That difference explains why affairs were not always confronted with explosive anger. Instead, they were watched, measured, and eventually guided toward a conclusion that preserved order. The goal was not a dramatic victory, but quiet stability. Many wives understood this better than anyone. They had been raised in households where reputation meant survival. They knew that patience, timing, and restraint could accomplish more than any open accusation. From the outside, the great houses of Tudor England appeared calm and disciplined. Guests dined together, servants moved through corridors carrying trays and letters, and the routines of noble life continued without interruption. Yet behind those calm routines, every household understood an unspoken truth. Desire might wander for a time, but the structure of marriage remained firmly anchored in law, tradition, and family honor. Tudor marriage was never built on fleeting affection, but on land, lineage, and reputation. Yet, within these orderly households, quiet affairs could still appear, tolerated only as long as they remained under control. And in many of those homes, a wife was already watching carefully, waiting for the moment when desire would begin to fade. Desire rarely disappears all at once. In the noble households of Tudor England, it faded slowly, like candlelight weakening in a long corridor after midnight. What had once felt urgent and thrilling gradually settled into something quieter and less certain. The affair that once demanded secrecy and excitement began to lose its urgency beneath the weight of ordinary life. At the beginning, such attachments often carried the energy of novelty. A husband who spent his days surrounded by political negotiations, estate management, and rigid social expectations might find temporary escape in the attention of a mistress. Her presence offered a sense of admiration and ease that formal marriage rarely provided. In a world governed by duty, that difference could feel intoxicating, yet the conditions that created the affair were rarely permanent. Tudor noblemen were not idle figures drifting through romantic adventures. Their lives were crowded with responsibilities that gradually pulled their attention back toward family, court, and reputation. Political alliances demanded careful attention, and the shifting favour of the monarch could transform a man's fortunes in a matter of months. As those responsibilities grew heavier, the excitement of secrecy began to feel less attractive. What once seemed thrilling could slowly become inconvenient. Meetings required planning, letters required caution, and every unexpected glance from a servant or visitor carried the possibility of rumour. The hidden relationship began to demand more effort than it once did. Age also played its quiet role. Many affairs began during moments of restlessness in middle life, when ambition and curiosity pushed men toward distractions beyond their household walls. But as years passed, that restlessness often gave way to caution. Experience had taught them how fragile a reputation could be. The mistress, who once appeared as a source of excitement, could gradually begin to represent risk. Her presence in letters or whispered conversations might threaten the careful balance of alliances that surrounded a noble household. What had once seemed harmless now required constant management. This shift was rarely dramatic. There were no sudden declarations or dramatic endings. Instead, small changes appeared in ordinary routines. A letter arrived later than expected. A visit was postponed because of court obligations. A journey that once seemed urgent was quietly delayed. Such changes often passed unnoticed at first. The mistress might interpret them as temporary interruptions caused by politics or travel. In Tudor England, noblemen were frequently absent for weeks while attending court sessions, hunting expeditions, or diplomatic gatherings. Distance was a familiar feature of aristocratic life, but distance had a curious effect on affection. Without the immediacy of presence, emotional excitement could fade quickly. What had once felt vivid in private chambers began to lose clarity when separated by long journeys and competing responsibilities. Meanwhile, the daily rhythm of the household continued. Estate matters required supervision. Tenants demanded attention, and family obligations filled the calendar with dinners, visits, and religious observances. These routines quietly reinforced the central position of marriage within noble life. In comparison, the affair began to appear increasingly fragile. It existed outside the structures that gave stability to family and property. Without the constant reinforcement of secrecy and attention, its intensity slowly weakened. Another subtle change often emerged during this period. The gifts that once accompanied the affair became less frequent. Jewelry, fabric, and coins had once served as visible symbols of affection. Over time, however, these gestures began to feel unnecessary or excessive. Economic caution sometimes played a role as well. Managing large estates required careful spending, especially during periods of poor harvest or political uncertainty. Extravagant gifts to a mistress could attract attention from relatives or advisors who already watched the household closely. The mistress might not immediately recognize the meaning behind these changes. From her perspective, the relationship had once carried promise and security. Yet in the world of Tudor society, affection alone rarely guaranteed permanence. What replaced excitement was something quieter and far less romantic. Familiarity slowly transformed passion into routine. The words that once felt meaningful became predictable. The meetings that once carried anticipation began to resemble obligations. This transformation was not unique to Tudor England. Even in modern life, many relationships fade, not through conflict, but through repetition. What once seemed extraordinary gradually becomes ordinary, and ordinary moments rarely sustain the same intensity. In noble households, however, this fading carried larger consequences. Marriage remained the central structure, protecting property, lineage, and reputation. Any relationship outside that structure depended entirely upon continued enthusiasm. Once enthusiasm weakened, the balance shifted naturally. The wife, whose authority had never truly disappeared, remained at the center of the household. Servants still answered to her instructions. Relatives still acknowledged her position, and the legitimacy of the family rested firmly in her presence. The mistress, by contrast, existed in a far more uncertain position. Without the constant energy of the affair, her influence began to diminish almost immediately. Invitations arrived less often, and the informal networks that once welcomed her presence quietly adjusted their distance. These changes rarely required confrontation. They unfolded through silence, patience, and time. The affair had once depended upon secrecy to survive. Ironically, it now began to dissolve through the same quiet conditions. For the husband, the transformation often felt strangely natural. What had once seemed irresistible now appeared unnecessary. The familiar routines of household life offered stability that secret relationships could never provide. The affair did not end with a dramatic decision. Instead, it gradually lost its importance until it no longer justified the risks it carried. The excitement that once sustained the affair had slowly given way to caution and routine. Yet, as the husband withdrew his attention, the quiet balance inside the household began to shift in subtle ways. And somewhere within those silent corridors, a wife was beginning to understand that patience might soon bring the outcome she had been waiting for. In Tudor England, the position of a lawful wife rested on foundations far stronger than affection. Her authority did not depend on charm, novelty, or the unpredictable currents of desire. It was secured by institutions that shaped the entire structure of society: the church, the law, and the long traditions of inheritance that governed noble families. Marriage in this world was not merely a private arrangement between two individuals. It was a solemn contract witnessed by the church and recognized by the crown. When vows were spoken before the altar, they carried legal and spiritual weight that extended far beyond the emotions of the couple involved. The union became part of a larger framework that preserved lineage and property across generations. Because of this structure, the wife occupied a position that could not easily be displaced. A mistress might attract admiration or attention, but she remained outside the legal order that protected family life. The wife, by contrast, stood firmly within it. Her role was recognized not only by her husband, but by priests, lawyers, relatives, and servants who understood the boundaries of legitimate authority. Within noble households, this authority revealed itself in quiet but powerful ways. The wife supervised the rhythm of daily life, ensuring that the estate functioned smoothly from one season to the next. She directed servants, organized household accounts, and maintained the complex network of responsibilities that kept large properties running. These tasks were not minor domestic concerns. Managing an estate required discipline and awareness of countless small details. Food supplies had to be stored for the winter months. Tenants required supervision, and repairs demanded careful planning. The household itself was a small world of labor and order, and the wife stood at its center. Her influence extended most clearly through the children of the family. Legitimate sons and daughters represented the future of the household, carrying forward both name and inheritance. Their upbringing, therefore, required careful attention, education, discipline, and religious instruction all fell under the watchful presence of the mother. In this sense, the wife embodied continuity. While political alliances might shift and fortunes might rise or fall, the legitimacy of the family depended on her role as guardian of the next generation. No fleeting relationship could replace that responsibility. The Church reinforced this stability through its teachings. Marriage was not viewed as a temporary arrangement that could be easily dissolved. It was a sacred bond meant to endure, even when affection faded or difficulties appeared. Priests reminded noble families that vows spoken before God carried obligations that extended throughout a lifetime. This belief strengthened the position of the lawful wife. Even if a husband grew distracted by other attachments, the religious meaning of marriage remained unchanged. The wife continued to represent the legitimate heart of the household. The law offered an additional layer of protection. Property rights, inheritance rules, and legal customs all recognized the authority of the marriage bond. Estates passed through legitimate lines of descent, ensuring that land and titles remained connected to lawful heirs. These structures formed an invisible wall surrounding the position of the wife. A mistress might enjoy a period of favor, but she could never step fully inside this protected space. Her influence depended entirely on the husband's attention, and attention was one of the most fragile forms of power. Meanwhile, the wife required no constant display of affection to maintain her position. Her authority rested on permanence rather than passion. Even in moments when her husband appeared distracted by other interests, the foundations of her role remained intact. Servants understood this hierarchy instinctively. They might whisper about private affairs or observe unusual visits, but their loyalty ultimately remained with the lawful mistress of the household. She controlled the structure of their work and the stability of their employment. Relatives also reinforced this balance. Families that had arranged a marriage expected it to endure because the union tied together land, influence, and future alliances. Protecting that connection mattered more than any temporary distraction. Over time, these forces worked quietly but steadily. The mistress existed within a narrow circle of personal attention, while the wife remained surrounded by the full weight of tradition, law, and social expectation. For the husband, this difference often became clearer as initial excitement faded. The household, with its responsibilities and obligations, stood firmly in place each day. The mistress, however charming she might be, offered little that could compete with the stability of family and inheritance. In this way, the wife's power rarely needed to be displayed openly. It existed in the steady continuation of ordinary life. Meals were served, accounts were recorded, children were taught, and the estate continued its work season after season. To modern observers, this quiet authority may appear almost invisible, yet within the society of Tudor England, it represented one of the most durable forms of power available to women. A mistress might shine briefly in moments of fascination, but the lawful wife stood within the long structure of family history. Her presence connected the past of the household to its future, and in a world where lineage and reputation shaped every decision, that connection was something no passing desire could ever truly replace. The lawful wife stood at the center of a structure built on religion, law, and inheritance. Yet while this authority remained steady, subtle changes were already unfolding within the household itself. Before long, a small shift in a husband's behavior would reveal that something inside the marriage had begun to change. In many Tudor households, change did not announce itself with noise. It arrived quietly, slipping into daily life through the smallest gestures. A marriage that had endured years of routine often developed a rhythm that everyone within the household understood without explanation. Servants noticed it in the way doors opened at certain hours. Relatives recognized it in the pattern of letters exchanged between estates, and the wife herself sensed it in the subtle movements of her husband's attention. For a long time, the affair might have existed like a distant echo in the background of family life. It was rarely spoken about directly, yet its presence could be felt in the occasional absence of the husband or the unusual arrival of messages sealed with unfamiliar wax. These signs were rarely dramatic. They appeared as small disturbances within an otherwise stable routine. A husband who once left the house before dawn might now linger a little longer at breakfast. A journey that once seemed urgent might be postponed without explanation. The letters that once required secrecy might arrive less frequently, sometimes disappearing altogether. None of these changes demanded immediate attention. Yet together, they created a quiet shift that could not easily be ignored. In the large stone houses of Tudor England, observation was often a silent skill. Noble women learned early that household life required patience more than confrontation. Anger could invite gossip, and gossip could spread quickly through servants, neighbors, and distant relatives. Calme, attention. However, allowed truths to reveal themselves without unnecessary drama. The wife, therefore, watched carefully, not with suspicion but with awareness. She noticed the way her husband's conversations drifted toward estate matters rather than private errands. His evenings grew quieter, often spent reviewing letters or discussing family obligations with advisors. Even his posture seemed different, as if some earlier urgency had slowly dissolved. These were not signs of affection returning suddenly. Instead, they suggested something else, a fading of the excitement that had once pulled him away from home. The restless energy that had fueled secrecy appeared to weaken under the weight of responsibility and routine. For the husband, this transformation often happened gradually enough that he barely recognized it himself. What had once required elaborate planning began to feel unnecessary. The thrill of hidden meetings slowly gave way to the comfort of familiar surroundings. Within the household, everything already existed in orderly balance. The mistress, who had once occupied a vivid place in his thoughts, began to feel distant. Letters that once demanded immediate replies could wait for days. Gifts that once seemed essential now appeared excessive. The effort required to maintain secrecy began to outweigh the pleasure it once offered. Meanwhile, the wife rarely needed to comment on these changes. Tudor society valued restraint, especially among women of noble rank. A composed silence could carry more authority than a direct accusation. By allowing events to unfold without confrontation, she preserved the dignity expected of her position. Servants noticed this calmness as well. In many households, the mistress of the house served as the quiet center around which daily life revolved. Her steadiness reassured the household that order remained intact, even when rumors drifted through corridors and kitchens. Gradually, the signs became clearer. The expensive gifts that had once disappeared from the household accounts no longer appeared. Couriers, who had once arrived discreetly at twilight, now travelled other roads. Invitations that might once have required careful excuses were accepted without hesitation. None of this required explanation. In Tudor England, much of life was governed by understanding rather than open discussion. Everyone within the household recognized that certain matters resolved themselves best through patience. For the wife, recognition of this shift brought neither triumph nor celebration. Instead, it confirmed something she had likely suspected for some time. Passion, especially the kind built upon secrecy and novelty, rarely lasted forever. Time, responsibility, and reputation slowly eroded its strength. In a modern world that values open confrontation, this quiet recognition may seem unusual. Today, many people expect conflict to reveal truth immediately. Tudor households operated differently. Silence often carried a deeper meaning than words. The wife, therefore, allowed the change to unfold naturally. She maintained the routines of the household, attended to her children, and continued her responsibilities with the same composure as before. Her authority did not require dramatic gestures. The husband, perhaps without fully realizing it, began to return more fully to the life that had always surrounded him. The estate required his attention. His family depended upon his presence, and the reputation of his household remained tied to his decisions. Within those steady routines, the affair gradually lost its place. What had once felt urgent slowly became irrelevant. The wife had quietly recognized the moment when her husband's attention began to turn away from secrecy and back toward the household. In the calm routines of Tudor life, Such changes rarely required confrontation or dramatic words. Silence itself was beginning to guide the marriage toward a resolution. Neither of them needed to speak aloud. In the quiet world of Tudor households, control often began not with action, but with restraint. Noble women learned early that reputation could be damaged more easily by anger than by silence. A wife who reacted with jealousy risked creating the very scandal she hoped to avoid. The safest response was often the calmest one. Within the stone walls of great houses scattered across England, servants moved constantly through corridors carrying trays, letters, and whispered observations. Every raised voice echoed through these spaces. A moment of public anger could travel from the kitchen to the stables within minutes, growing larger with each retelling. For this reason, experienced wives understood that composure was not merely a personal virtue, it was a form of protection. Maintaining a steady appearance ensured that the household continued to function without disruption, and it prevented rumours from gaining unnecessary strength. When suspicion of an affair existed, the temptation to confront it openly could be strong. Yet open confrontation rarely served the interests of a Tudor marriage. A loud accusation could invite witnesses, and witnesses created stories that travelled beyond the estate. Once gossip escaped the walls of the house, it could reach relatives, allies, and even the royal court. Instead, many wives chose a quieter path. They continued the daily rhythm of the household, as if nothing unusual had occurred. Meals were prepared at the usual hour. Guests were welcomed with the expected politeness, and family prayers continued beneath the same candlelit ceilings. This outward calm often confused observers who expected an emotional reaction. Servants who had noticed unusual letters or whispered messages sometimes waited for signs of anger from their mistress. Instead, they found her directing the household with the same composed authority as before. Such steadiness carried a quiet message. By refusing to display jealousy, the wife protected both her dignity and the reputation of the family. In Tudor society, appearance often carried more influence than private truth. Public jealousy suggested weakness. A noble woman who appeared unable to govern her own emotions might be judged as incapable of managing a household. Calmness, on the other hand, reinforced the impression of discipline and authority. There was also a practical reason for this restraint. A husband who faced public humiliation might respond defensively rather than thoughtfully. Anger could push him further away from the household, strengthening the very attachment the wife hoped would fade. Silence allowed a different outcome. Without confrontation, the husband remained free to reconsider his choices without feeling publicly challenged. The household continued to provide the stability that secret relationships could rarely offer. This strategy did not require passivity. The wife remained attentive to every detail around her. She noticed which letters arrived, which visitors appeared at the gates, and how her husband's schedule shifted from week to week. Observation replaced accusation. In many ways, the great Tudor houses encouraged this quiet vigilance. Their long corridors and dimly lit rooms created spaces where people watched one another carefully without speaking openly. Servants carried information from one chamber to another, and subtle gestures often revealed more than direct conversation. Within this environment, a calm wife possessed an advantage. She could allow events to unfold while preserving her authority. The household remained orderly under her supervision, reminding everyone of her permanent position within the family. The mistress, by contrast, existed in a far more fragile situation. Her influence depended upon secrecy and continued attention. If that attention began to weaken, she had little control over the outcome. Meanwhile, the husband gradually returned to the routines that had always defined his life. Estate matters demanded decisions. Political responsibilities required travel, and family obligations filled the calendar with ceremonies and visits. The calm stability of the household quietly surrounded him again. In this atmosphere, The absence of confrontation often proved more powerful than any accusation. The wife's composure created space for reflection. Without dramatic conflict, the husband could recognize the risks of his affair without feeling forced into defiance. To modern observers, such restraint might appear almost unnatural. Contemporary culture often encourages immediate expression of anger or betrayal. Tudor society valued something different. Patience and discipline were seen as marks of strength. For noble women especially, dignity was inseparable from influence. By maintaining control over her emotions, the wife preserved the image that sustained her authority. She remained the stable center of the household, while the excitement of secrecy slowly lost its energy. In the end, calmness was not weakness, but strategy. It allowed the marriage to absorb tension without collapsing into scandal. The wife chose restraint instead of confrontation, protecting the dignity of her household through careful silence. Within the steady routines of the estate, this calm presence quietly reshaped the balance of the marriage. And as the household continued its orderly life, another subtle strategy was beginning to take form. A Tudor household rarely changed through sudden declarations. Instead, the atmosphere inside a noble home could shift slowly, guided by routine and careful attention. Once a wife understood that patience was her strongest protection, she often began to adjust the environment around her husband in subtle ways. These changes did not appear dramatic to outside observers. The household continued its ordinary rhythm of meals, visitors, and correspondence. Yet beneath this familiar pattern, the wife quietly increased her presence within the spaces her husband moved through each day. In earlier months, he might have spent long stretches away from the estate. Political duties, hunting journeys, or unexplained visits could carry him far from home for days at a time. Now the structure of household life began to draw him back more frequently. The wife did not demand this change. Instead, she made the home itself more active, more visible, and more difficult to ignore. Family gatherings became more frequent. Invitations were sent to relatives who had long supported the marriage alliance. These visits filled the house with familiar voices and the steady presence of kinship. Cousins arrived with news from neighboring estates. Elder relatives offered advice on matters of land and inheritance. Younger children ran through corridors that had once been quiet. In Tudor society, family presence carried great weight. A household filled with relatives reminded everyone of the alliances that marriage had created. The husband was no longer simply an individual navigating private desires. He stood at the center of a network of obligations, stretching across families and estates. Dinners became occasions of quiet reinforcement. Long wooden tables were laid with heavy cloths and simple silverware, while candles cast warm light across the room. Conversation moved easily between subjects of land management, politics, and family history. Within these gatherings, the wife appeared calm and capable, guiding the flow of hospitality with practiced ease. Servants responded quickly to her instructions, and guests recognized her authority without question. The stability she represented became visible in every small detail. The husband, sitting among relatives and advisors, could not ignore the structure surrounding him. These were the people whose alliances had shaped his marriage and whose approval supported his position in society. Their presence quietly reminded him of the responsibilities he carried. Meanwhile, the rhythms of the household began to revolve more clearly around legitimate family life. Children were brought more frequently into shared spaces where their father spent his time. Lessons, meals, and evening prayers became moments of visible family unity. Such scenes were not arranged as dramatic displays. They simply reflected the steady continuation of life within the estate. Yet their effect was powerful. The household began to feel less like a place of routine and more like the center of a living family. For a man whose attention had once been drawn towards secrecy, this atmosphere created a subtle contrast. The mistress existed outside these gatherings. She did not share the table with relatives or participate in the rituals that bound the family together. Her world remained separate, dependent upon private meetings and hidden messages. In comparison, the household itself offered a sense of permanence that secrecy could never provide. The wife understood this difference without needing to speak about it directly. By strengthening the presence of family life, she allowed the structure of marriage to become more visible to her husband each day. Even small details contributed to this atmosphere. Letters from relatives were read aloud in the evening. Plans for future alliances were discussed quietly near the fireplace. Estate matters required the husband's attention, drawing him deeper into the responsibilities that defined his position. Gradually, the household itself became a reminder of stability. Within its walls existed land, children, reputation, and history. These elements formed the foundation of noble life in Tudor England. The mistress offered excitement, but the household offered continuity. Over time, that difference grew increasingly difficult to ignore. To modernize, such strategies might appear indirect, yet within the social order of the 16th century, they were remarkably effective. Open conflict could damage reputation, but a strengthened family environment quietly guided behavior without creating scandal. The wife did not need to argue for her place. The household itself spoke for her. Every shared meal, every visit from relatives, and every moment of ordinary routine reinforced the legitimacy of the marriage. In this way, the atmosphere of the home gradually shifted. What had once been a space occasionally overshadowed by secrecy now became the clear center of the husband's life once again. The wife quietly strengthened the presence of family life within the household. Relatives, routines, and responsibilities slowly surrounded the husband with reminders of his place within the family. Within this renewed atmosphere of legitimacy, another quiet pressure was beginning to reshape the fate of the affair. In Tudor England, the authority of marriage did not rest only within the walls of the household. It was supported by institutions that shaped nearly every aspect of social life. The church and the law formed a powerful framework surrounding every noble family, defining obligations that extended far beyond personal feelings. A wife did not need to invoke these forces loudly. Their presence was already understood by everyone involved. The marriage vows spoken before the altar were not merely ceremonial words. They carried religious meaning that echoed through sermons, parish gatherings, and the daily prayers that structured life across the country. Within this world, religion acted as a constant reminder of duty. Every Sunday service repeated the language of loyalty, discipline, and responsibility. Husbands were reminded of their roles as heads of households, while wives were praised for maintaining stability and order. These teachings shaped the expectations surrounding noble marriages. A union blessed by the church was expected to endure through difficulty, even when affection weakened or tensions appeared. The structure of the marriage remained sacred. A thoughtful wife understood how powerful these ideas could be. She did not need to accuse her husband directly or expose his private behavior. Instead, she could allow the quiet language of religion to speak where personal argument might fail. Such reminders often appeared in ordinary conversation. During an evening discussion, a passing reference to a recent sermon might arise. A priest's words about the responsibilities of marriage could be mentioned calmly, without accusation or emphasis. These moments rarely sounded like warnings. They felt more like reflections on shared beliefs. Yet within the moral atmosphere of Tudor society, such remarks carried unmistakable meaning. The husband, hearing these references, would understand the message without needing it explained. His reputation, his family, and his own sense of honor were closely tied to the religious expectations surrounding marriage. Religion was only one part of the structure surrounding a noble household. The law offered an equally strong reminder of marital obligation. Inheritance customs, property rights, and family alliances all depended upon the legitimacy of the marriage bond. A public scandal could threaten more than personal dignity. It might raise questions about inheritance, invite disputes among relatives, or weaken alliances carefully built through marriage. Noble families were acutely aware of how fragile a reputation could be when exposed to public rumour. Again, a wife rarely needed to speak of these dangers directly. The mere suggestion that gossip might spread beyond the estate could be enough. Tudor society relied heavily on informal networks of information carried by servants, travellers, and visiting relatives. A rumour that began in a single household could travel quickly through neighbouring estates. By the time it reached the ears of distant relatives or political allies, the story might grow far larger than its original truth. The husband understood this risk as well as anyone. His position within the social hierarchy depended on maintaining respect among peers. Even the suggestion of scandal could damage alliances or invite unwelcome scrutiny. In such circumstances, a wife's calm reminders often carried greater influence than confrontation. A quiet reference to the importance of reputation could remind her husband of the fragile balance he was risking. These conversations rarely felt dramatic. They unfolded in the same steady tone that governed other aspects of household life. The wife might speak while reviewing letters, supervising servants, or discussing upcoming visits from relatives. Because the message arrived without anger, it allowed the husband to reflect rather than react defensively. He could recognize the implications of his behavior without feeling publicly challenged. In this way, law and religion acted as silent allies for the wife. She did not wield them as weapons. Instead, she allowed their authority to exist quietly in the background of everyday life. The mistress, by contrast, stood entirely outside these protections. Her relationship with her husband carried no blessing from the church and no recognition from the law. It existed only through private attention and secrecy. As that secrecy became more difficult to maintain, the contrast between the two relationships grew sharper. One stood firmly within the accepted structure of society. The other depended on silence that could collapse at any moment. Gradually, these pressures shaped the husband's thinking. Religious duty, legal responsibility, and the threat of scandal all pointed toward the same conclusion. Continuing the affair no longer appeared harmless. Yet this realization did not arrive through confrontation. It emerged slowly, shaped by reminders that felt almost casual. To modern observers, such a subtle influence might appear indirect. In Tudor society, however, it represented a powerful strategy. Authority rarely needed to raise its voice when the weight of tradition already spoke clearly. The wife remained composed throughout these moments. She did not demand a confession or an apology. Instead, she allowed the structures surrounding marriage to guide the outcome. Over time, those structures grew impossible to ignore. The quiet authority of religion and law slowly reminded the husband of the obligations tied to his marriage. Within the calm conversations of the household, these reminders carried more weight than any accusation. And as the risks of scandal became clearer, another silent strategy was beginning to tighten around the fading affair. In the society of Tudor England, few forces carried more weight than honour. Reputation was not simply a matter of personal pride. It was the invisible thread connecting land, inheritance, family alliances, and the future of children. When honour was questioned, the consequences could reach far beyond a single household. For noble families, the idea of honour was tied closely to lineage. A family name carried generations of history behind it. Estates had been built, alliances arranged, and fortunes protected through careful management of reputation. One careless scandal could disturb that balance in ways that might take decades to repair. Because of this, the concept of honour rarely needed to be explained. Everyone within the household understood its importance. Servants might whisper about private matters in kitchens or stables, but they also recognized the boundaries that surrounded noble reputation. A wife who understood this social structure did not need to accuse her husband directly. Instead, she could allow the idea of honour to enter conversation in quiet and indirect ways. The message rarely sounded like a warning. It appeared as a simple reminder of the responsibilities that accompanied a noble life. Often, these reminders centered on the children of the household. Sons, in particular, represented the continuation of the family name, their inheritance, education, and future alliances depended upon the reputation maintained by their parents. A casual remark about the future of a son could carry a surprising influence. The wife might speak about the alliances that would one day be arranged for him, or the respect he would need to command among other noble families. Such comments appeared harmless on the surface, yet they pointed towards something deeper. The husband could not ignore the meaning behind them. His own reputation would shape the path available to his children. If a scandal surrounded the household, those children might inherit not only land, but also the burden of whispered rumours. Property added another layer of concern. Tudor estates were complex structures of land, tenants, and legal agreements. Maintaining them required careful attention to inheritance rules and family alliances. Any disruption to the stability of marriage could raise difficult questions about legitimacy and succession. Again, these ideas did not need to be presented as threats. The wife might simply discuss estate matters with the calm practicality expected of her position. Accounts could be reviewed, letters from relatives considered, and plans for the future of the family lands quietly discussed. Within these conversations, the husband began to recognize the fragile balance surrounding his household. The affair that once seemed harmless now existed within a network of responsibilities that could not easily be ignored. Honour also extended beyond the walls of the estate. Tudor England was a society deeply connected through observation and rumour. Travellers, merchants, and visiting relatives carried stories from one region to another. A single whisper could grow into a reputation that followed a family for years. The husband understood this reality well. His position among other nobles depended not only on wealth, but also on the perception of dignity and discipline. A man known for scandal risked losing influence in subtle yet damaging ways. By contrast, a household known for stability inspired confidence. Allies trusted families who governed themselves with restraint. Marriages that endured without public conflict strengthened the image of reliability that noble society valued. The wife's quiet references to honour, therefore, carried a powerful meaning. She did not demand change. Instead, she allowed her husband to see clearly what stood at stake. In many cases, this recognition arrived gradually. A man who once treated his affair as a private matter began to realize that its consequences might reach much further. Reputation, inheritance, and the future of his children were all connected to the decisions he made. The mistress, who existed outside this network of obligations, could not easily compete with such forces. Her presence offered excitement and attention, but it did not strengthen the foundations of family life. Gradually, the husband began to weigh these realities. What had once felt thrilling now appeared fragile. The risks surrounding the affair grew clearer with each passing day. This moment of reflection rarely required confrontation. The wife had not raised her voice or demanded explanations. She had only allowed the quiet language of honour to enter the household once again. Within Tudor society, that language carried immense power. Honour had quietly entered the centre of the conversation without a single argument. The future of children and the security of property now stood beside the fading excitement of the affair. Faced with these realities, the husband began to reconsider choices that once seemed easy. In Tudor society, influence did not depend only on wealth or affection. It also relied on access. Invitations, visits, and shared gatherings created the social fabric that connected noble families to one another. Within that delicate web, presence mattered almost as much as reputation. A mistress who gained attention from a powerful man often found herself moving through these circles with surprising ease. At first, she might appear quietly at dinners, hunting gatherings, or seasonal celebrations hosted by allied families. Her place there was rarely acknowledged openly, yet her presence could be felt. Servants recognized her arrival. Guests noticed the small gestures exchanged across a crowded room. Over time, familiarity began to soften the boundaries that once separated her from the household. Yet these same social networks could withdraw just as quietly as they had opened. Once a wife recognized that the affair was losing its strength, she rarely needed confrontation to alter the situation. Instead, she allowed the household's social patterns to shift in subtle ways. Invitations became less frequent. A gathering that once included the mistress now proceeded without her name appearing on the list. The explanation rarely sounded deliberate. There might be limited space at the table, a smaller celebration than usual, or a family occasion reserved for close relatives. At first, such changes appeared minor. Tudor society was filled with events, and not every gathering could include every guest. Yet as weeks passed, the pattern became harder to ignore. The mistress might notice that she heard about dinners only after they had taken place. Hunting parties departed without the quiet message that once reached her door. Conversations at court or in nearby estates carried fewer references to her presence. These shifts were rarely spoken aloud. They unfolded through absence rather than confrontation. Social life continued exactly as before, but the mistress slowly found herself standing outside the circle that once welcomed her. Family influence played an important role in this process. Noble marriages connected entire networks of relatives who supported one another through alliances and shared interests. When those relatives began to gather more frequently around the wife, the balance of social power changed quickly. Relatives visiting the estate reinforced the legitimacy of the household. Their presence reminded guests and servants alike where the true authority of the family rested. The mistress, by contrast, had no comparable support. She might possess charm, beauty, or temporary influence, but she rarely commanded the loyalty of an entire family network. Without invitations and social acknowledgement, her position weakened with surprising speed. Even casual encounters became less comfortable. At earlier gatherings, guests might have treated her with polite curiosity or quiet acceptance. Now, their greetings grew shorter. Conversations ended sooner than before. Such reactions did not necessarily come from cruelty. In Tudor society, people often responded to shifting power by adjusting their behavior quietly. When the wife's authority became more visible again, others instinctively moved closer to her side. The mistress, therefore, experienced a subtle but unmistakable isolation. Rooms that once felt welcoming began to feel uncertain. Conversations paused when she entered, and laughter sometimes resumed only after she moved away. Meanwhile, the wife continued to host gatherings with calm composure. Dinners proceeded under candlelight. Relatives exchanged news of estates and marriages, and the household presented the image of stability that noble society admired. Within this environment, the absence of the mistress grew more noticeable than her presence had ever been. Without invitations or family support, she found fewer opportunities to appear within the social spaces that had once sustained her influence. For the husband, these changes often carried a quiet clarity. The household around him appeared stronger and more unified, while the connection beyond it seemed increasingly fragile. An affair that once thrived on attention could struggle to survive without it. Social life had provided the stage on which the relationship once unfolded. Now that stage gradually disappeared. To modern observers, such strategies might seem indirect. Yet within Tudor society, reputation and visibility formed the foundation of influence. Removing one person from that network could alter the balance of power without a single argument. The mistress rarely heard a formal dismissal. Instead, she encountered an emptiness where opportunity had once existed. In the calm corridors of noble estates, absence could speak more loudly than accusation. The mistress slowly found herself standing outside the gatherings that once welcomed her presence. Within the household, family alliances and social routines quietly gathered around the lawful wife once again. In that widening silence, the affair began to lose the attention it had always depended upon. Quiet settlements were often the final stage of many Tudor affairs. By the time this moment arrived, the excitement that once surrounded the relationship had already begun to fade. What remained was not passion, but calculation. Within noble households, decisions were rarely guided by emotion alone. Marriage among the Tudor aristocracy functioned as a foundation of order. Land, inheritance, and alliances all rested upon the stability of a household. When an affair threatened that balance, the goal was rarely revenge. Instead, the priority became restoring control without attracting attention. By this stage, both husband and wife usually understood the situation clearly. The husband recognized that the affair had begun to damage the stability of his household. The wife understood that open confrontation could create the very scandal she wished to avoid. Because of this shared understanding, conversations between them often took on a different tone. Earlier tensions slowly gave way to a quieter form of negotiation. These discussions rarely took place before witnesses. They happened in private chambers or during calm evenings when the estate had grown silent. Servants had withdrawn to their quarters, and the corridors of the house carried only the soft movement of candlelight. Within that stillness, husband and wife could speak carefully about the future of the household. The first concern was always reputation. Tudor society watched noble families closely. A single rumour could move quickly from servants to merchants, from merchants to local gentry, and eventually into the hearing of powerful allies. Once gossip began to circulate widely, it became difficult to contain. Even false rumours could damage alliances and weaken influence at court. For that reason, the central condition of many quiet agreements was simple: there would be no public scandal. The wife did not demand humiliation or confession. She did not seek dramatic gestures of regret. Instead, she required something far more important in Tudor society: discretion. The husband, who understood the fragile nature of reputation, often accepted this condition readily. Preserving dignity protected not only his marriage, but also the wider network of relationships connected to his family. A nobleman who became known for uncontrolled scandal risked losing trust among allies. Business arrangements could falter. Marriage negotiations for children could become more difficult. Therefore, silence became the first pillar of the agreement. Yet another question soon followed. What would happen to the woman who had once held the husband's attention? Completely abandoning her carried its own dangers. A mistress who suddenly lost support might grow desperate. Desperation could lead to anger, and anger could lead to stories that spread far beyond the walls of a single estate. To prevent this possibility, many Tudor affairs ended with discreet financial arrangements. The husband might provide a modest allowance that allowed the woman to live quietly elsewhere. In some cases, a small property was granted in a distant village or town. In others, trusted relatives or allies offered her a place within their household. These arrangements were rarely discussed openly. They were handled quietly through letters, trusted intermediaries, or legal documents prepared with careful wording. The purpose was not generosity alone. Financial security reduced the risk that the mistress would speak openly about the relationship. The wife often understood this reasoning perfectly. Though she might never express sympathy, she recognized that a controlled departure served the interests of the household. At the same time, the agreement required clear boundaries. Once the settlement was arranged, the connection between husband and mistress had to end completely. Letters would stop. Visits would cease. Any further contact could revive the rumors that the agreement was meant to prevent. For the husband, accepting these limits often required a quiet shift in perspective. The affair that once seemed thrilling now appeared fragile and temporary. The household around him, his estate, his children, his name, represented something far more permanent. Gradually, the rhythms of family life returned. Meals were shared without tension. Correspondence with relatives resumed its ordinary tone. Visitors entered the house without sensing the shadow of conflict. Meanwhile, The mistress disappeared from the centre of attention. She might continue her life elsewhere, supported by the arrangement that allowed her to avoid immediate hardship. Yet her connection to the household faded into the distance. The marriage, however imperfect, remained intact. The estate continued to function as before. Alliances remained secure. Within the logic of Tudor society, this quiet resolution often mattered more than emotional truth. The household had survived without public scandal. Reputation remained intact. Stability had been restored. In the world of Tudor nobility, that outcome was often considered the most successful ending possible. The affair ended not with confrontation, but with a quiet understanding that protected reputation and restored order inside the household. That silent agreement soon began to spread through the routines of the estate, shaping how letters moved and doors quietly closed. Somewhere within those ordinary movements, people who were never meant to lead the story would begin guiding its final distance. Large Tudor households moved according to routines that seemed ordinary on the surface. Candles were lit, doors were opened, letters were delivered, and meals were carried from kitchens to long tables in the great hall. Yet within these quiet movements, servants formed the hidden structure of the household. They saw nearly everything, heard fragments of conversations, and understood patterns that even the nobles themselves sometimes overlooked. Because of this position, servants often became an important part of how delicate situations were managed. When an affair began to fade, and the household attempted to restore order, the behavior of servants quietly shifted. The change rarely came with spoken commands. Instead, it appeared through small adjustments in daily routines that gradually reduced the space in which the relationship could continue. Letters were often the first point of control. Communication in Tudor society relied heavily on written messages. Couriers carried letters between estates, towns, and the court. Within the household, these messages usually passed through the hands of stewards, clerks, or trusted servants before reaching their destination. A mistress who wished to maintain contact with a nobleman often relied on this system. Letters allowed conversations to continue when travel or distance made meetings difficult. When the household decided that the affair should end quietly, this channel became less reliable. A letter might be delivered later than expected. Another might remain unanswered for several days. A message that once reached the master of the house directly might now pass through additional hands before arriving. No servant openly declared interference. Everything still appeared orderly and respectful. Yet the rhythm of communication gradually slowed. A delayed response could create uncertainty. Uncertainty could weaken the habit of writing altogether. At the same time, opportunities for private meetings began to disappear. Large estates provided many spaces where discreet encounters could once occur. Gardens, side corridors, and unused chambers offered moments of privacy when servants chose not to intervene. As the household shifted its priorities, those silent allowances ended. A servant might enter a corridor earlier than usual while carrying candles. Another might remain near a doorway longer than necessary while arranging furniture. Footsteps could be heard approaching rooms that once remained undisturbed. Each interruption appeared completely ordinary, yet together they made secrecy difficult. For the mistress, these changes could feel subtle but persistent. A meeting that once seemed simple now required careful timing. Even then, unexpected movements within the household often disrupted the opportunity. Servants also played a role in delivering indirect messages. Confrontation between the mistress and the household was rarely desirable. Instead, polite explanations travelled through intermediaries. A servant might carry a message explaining that the master of the house was occupied with family matters. Another might mention that relatives had arrived unexpectedly, requiring the household's attention. Such explanations sounded reasonable. They contained no accusation and offered no hostility. Yet their meaning gradually became clear. Access to the household had begun to close. Servants understood the hierarchy within which they lived. Their loyalty followed the authority of the household itself. When the wife's role as the centre of family life became more visible again, servants naturally adjusted their behaviour to reflect that balance. Guests who arrived at the estate were received formally. Letters addressed to the master passed through the steward's careful supervision. Meetings required explanation rather than assumption. Through these quiet adjustments, the structure of the household slowly reshaped the situation. The husband often noticed the change only gradually. Communication with the mistress became more complicated. Encounters that once occurred easily now seemed unlikely. The mistress felt the difference more sharply. The estate that once welcomed her presence began to feel distant and guarded. Rooms that once offered privacy now carried the sound of footsteps. Corridors felt busier than before. Servants who once greeted her with relaxed familiarity now spoke with polite restraint. None of this appeared openly hostile. That was precisely why it worked. In Tudor society, public confrontation could create a scandal. Quiet distance allowed relationships to dissolve without drawing attention. Servants, therefore, became the unseen hands guiding the household back toward stability. They carried letters, opened doors, and moved through corridors exactly as they always had. Yet within those ordinary tasks, they controlled the flow of information and opportunity. Gradually, the affair lost the structure that had allowed it to survive. Without reliable letters and without private meetings, the connection weakened. The relationship that once existed between hidden glances and secret messages slowly faded into the distance. The household returned to its familiar rhythm. Candles continued to glow along stone walls. Servants moved silently between rooms. Life appeared unchanged to anyone standing outside the story. Yet within those quiet routines, a private chapter had been carefully brought to an end. The affair began to fade as letters slowed and private meetings quietly disappeared from the household's routines. Servants, who once allowed small freedoms, now shaped the distance through ordinary duties. Somewhere beyond the estate walls, a woman slowly began to understand that the doors she once entered freely were closing one by one. The realization rarely arrived all at once. It unfolded slowly, almost quietly, through changes so small that they were difficult to notice at first. A mistress who had once moved easily within a noble household began to sense that something in the atmosphere had shifted. The change was not announced with anger or accusation. Tudor society rarely favoured dramatic endings when reputation was at stake. Instead, distance appeared gradually, like a door closing 1 inch at a time. One of the first signs was the absence of invitations. Earlier in the relationship, invitations had arrived frequently. They were sometimes written formally on folded parchment, sealed with wax, and carried by a trusted messenger. At other times, they came through informal channels. A servant quietly mentioning that the master of the house wished to see her, or that a dinner gathering would take place in the great hall. Such invitations once created a steady rhythm of visits. The mistress could expect to appear at the estate during certain weeks or seasons. Her presence might be explained as a social call, a family acquaintance, or simply a familiar guest. When the household began to close its doors, these invitations slowly disappeared. At first, the silence seemed temporary. Perhaps the estate was busy with visitors. Perhaps the household was travelling. Perhaps the master had pressing political matters to attend to. Days passed. Then weeks. No message arrived. Even when invitations did appear, they carried a different tone. The gatherings were larger and more formal. Many guests attended, leaving little opportunity for private conversation. The mistress might find herself seated far from the master at the dining table. Their exchanges were polite but brief. Servants moved constantly through the room, filling cups and carrying dishes. The atmosphere felt careful rather than welcoming. Another change appeared in the public gaze. In earlier months, the relationship might have existed quietly, but not entirely invisibly. A glance across a hall, a brief conversation during a gathering, or a shared moment in a garden could sustain the connection. Such gestures rarely escape the attention of others. All, courtiers, relatives, and servants often noticed these exchanges, even when they pretended not to. In Tudor society, subtle observations formed the currency of gossip. As the affair faded, those public signals began to vanish. The master of the house no longer sought her eyes across crowded rooms. Conversations remained short and distant, even when they stood within the same space. The familiarity between them had disappeared. The mistress gradually understood that the change was deliberate. The final sign, however, was not absence. It was indifference. Indifference carried a different weight from anger. Anger suggested lingering emotion, a connection strong enough to produce conflict. Indifference suggested something else entirely. The mistress might notice that the master spoke to her with the same courtesy he offered any other guest. His tone remained calm. His words were polite, yet nothing in his expression hinted at the intimacy that had once existed between them. Moments that once held meaning now felt ordinary. A walk through the garden became simply a walk among many others. A conversation during a gathering ended quickly, replaced by a discussion with another visitor. No accusation was spoken. No final declaration marked the end. The relationship dissolved quietly within the routines of social life. For the mistress, this realization often arrived in fragments. She noticed the empty weeks without letters. She observed how servants now guided her visits with careful formality. She saw the way conversations shortened, how glances that once lingered now moved elsewhere. Gradually, these details formed a pattern. The household had not rejected her openly. Instead, it had withdrawn the small privileges that once allowed the relationship to exist. Without invitations, meetings, or meaningful attention, the affair lost the space it required to continue. The mistress understood what this meant long before anyone spoke the words. The door had not been slammed shut. It had simply been allowed to close slowly until no space remained. In Tudor society, such endings were often considered the most practical. There was no scandal, no public humiliation, and no dramatic confrontation that could damage the reputation of the household. Life continued around the quiet conclusion. Guests still arrived at the estate. Music still played during evening gatherings. Servants carried candles along familiar corridors. Yet for the woman who once moved through these rooms with a different status, the atmosphere had changed completely. She now stood at the edge of a world that no longer made space for her presence. The invitations had grown fewer. The glances had disappeared, and conversations had turned politely distant. Within the ordinary life of the household, the relationship had quietly dissolved, and somewhere in that quiet distance, a woman finally understood that the door she once entered freely was now closed. Silence often became the most practical decision a Tudor nobleman could make when an affair reached its natural end. By the time that moment arrived, the excitement that once surrounded the relationship had already begun to fade. What remained was not desire, but calculation. In a society built upon reputation, public behavior mattered far more than private emotion. A nobleman lived inside a network of expectations that extended far beyond his household. His actions shaped how others judged his reliability, discipline, and judgment. Political alliances, friendships with powerful families, and influence at court all depended upon the impression he created. Because of this, public scandal carried risks that reached into every part of his life. Tudor politics operated through reputation as much as through authority. Courtiers watched each other carefully, observing who appeared disciplined and who allowed personal affairs to disrupt their responsibilities. A nobleman who became known for uncontrolled scandal could quickly lose the respect of allies. Even a rumor could weaken political standing. A story whispered during a gathering might travel through several households before reaching the ears of someone with influence. Once that happened, the damage was difficult to repair. People remembered the scandal long after the truth behind it had faded. For a man involved in political life, avoiding such rumours became essential. Ending the affair quietly offered a solution. Without dramatic confrontation, there was little material for gossip to grow from. The relationship simply faded, leaving no spectacle for others to discuss. Political caution, therefore, encouraged restraint. The husband understood that dignity in public life often required control in private life. A man who handled delicate matters calmly appeared far more trustworthy than one whose personal conflicts spilled into public view. Social position created another reason for silence. Tudor noble families existed within a delicate hierarchy of respect. Estates were connected through marriages, shared business interests, and mutual obligations. A scandal inside one household could disturb relationships across an entire network. If an affair became widely known, other families might question their association with the man involved. Invitations could quietly disappear. Negotiations concerning land or marriage alliances could become more difficult. Preserving social position, therefore, required careful management of personal matters. By ending the affair discreetly, the husband avoided forcing others to take sides. Friends and relatives could continue interacting with the household as if nothing had happened. The appearance of stability remained intact. Another important reason for choosing silence lay inside the home itself. Noble households were complex environments filled with relatives, children, and servants whose lives depended on the authority of the family. Open conflict between husband and wife could create tension that spreads quickly through the estate. Children might hear fragments of arguments. Servants might repeat overheard words in kitchens or stables. Such stories rarely remained contained within the walls of the house. A quiet resolution prevented that disruption. By allowing the affair to end without public confrontation, the husband preserved a sense of order within the family. Meals continued without awkward tension. Daily routines moved forward without the shadow of conflict hanging over them. The wife also benefited from this approach. She could maintain her dignity without appearing vindictive. Her authority within the household remained steady, rather than threatened by visible turmoil. In Tudor society, the appearance of harmony often mattered more than the emotional truth behind it. For the husband, this quiet strategy also allowed him to move forward without humiliation. Public confession would have forced him into a position of weakness before allies and rivals alike. Silence, by contrast, preserved his image as a man in control of his household. Gradually, the affair receded into memory. The mistress disappeared from gatherings. Letters ceased to arrive. Conversations returned to ordinary topics such as estate management, politics, and family affairs. Visitors entering the household saw only a stable marriage and a well-managed estate. For many Tudor noblemen, this outcome represented the safest possible conclusion. Reputation remained intact, alliances remained secure, and the structure of family life continued without visible damage. The affair had once brought excitement and secrecy. Its ending brought something far more valuable in Tudor society: control. Through silence, the husband protected the political and social world that shaped his future. And within that world, discretion often carried more power than any public declaration. Silence allowed the husband to protect his political reputation, social alliances, and the fragile balance inside his household. The affair disappeared without spectacle, leaving the appearance of stability untouched. Yet within that quiet ending, another figure in the story had already begun shaping what came afterward. Orders inside a Tudor household rarely appeared by accident. Behind the calm routines of daily life stood someone who understood how fragile a reputation could be. In many cases, that person was the wife. While the husband carried political authority outside the home, the wife often became the quiet manager of stability within it. When an affair began to fade, and the household needed to recover its balance, her role became especially important. A noble estate functioned like a small community. Servants moved through kitchens and corridors, relatives visited for extended periods, and guests arrived from neighbouring families. News travelled easily through these networks. Even the smallest disruption could become the subject of whispers before the day ended. Because of this, the wife's first task was simple but essential: maintain normal order. Daily routines continued without visible change. Meals were served at the usual times. Visitors were welcomed with the same calm hospitality. The household did not display signs of tension that might encourage speculation. This outward stability created the impression that nothing unusual had occurred. The wife rarely needed to explain her intentions openly. Her authority came from consistency. By continuing to manage the household with quiet discipline, she reminded everyone where the centre of family life remained. Servants followed the rhythm she established. Guests observed the atmosphere she created. The estate moved forward as if the brief disturbance had already passed. Another important responsibility involved controlling the spread of rumours. Tudor society thrived on observation. Servants heard fragments of conversations. Visitors noticed subtle changes in behaviour. These details could easily become the beginning of gossip. If such stories reached nearby estates or court circles, they might grow into something far larger than the original event. The wife, therefore, guided the flow of information carefully. Servants who might have witnessed unusual moments were given clear routines that kept them occupied. Work continued steadily, leaving little time for speculation. Those who served closest to the family understood that discretion was expected. At the same time, the wife maintained a calm and confident presence whenever guests visited. Her composure discouraged curiosity. People were far less likely to question a situation that appeared perfectly ordinary. When conversations drifted toward sensitive subjects, she often redirected them gently. A discussion about household matters might shift toward upcoming celebrations, family alliances, or estate improvements. In this way, attention moved naturally away from anything that could invite uncomfortable questions. A third responsibility involved shaping the explanations that circulated quietly among relatives and acquaintances. Even when a scandal was avoided, small changes in social patterns were sometimes noticed. A woman who had once appeared frequently at gatherings might suddenly disappear. Friends might wonder about the reason. Rather than leaving such questions unanswered, the wife ensured that simple and reasonable explanations existed. Perhaps the woman had travelled to visit distant relatives. Perhaps she had chosen to spend time away from court. Perhaps other family obligations had called her elsewhere. These explanations did not need to be elaborate. Their purpose was only to prevent speculation from turning into rumour. Within Tudor society, a clear and ordinary explanation often ended curiosity before it had time to grow. Through these careful actions, the wife performed a role that resembled what modern observers might describe as crisis management. She restored balance without drawing attention to the disruption that had occurred. Her authority did not rely on confrontation or punishment. Instead, it depended on patience, discipline, and an understanding of how reputation moved through social networks. The husband benefited from this quiet work as well. While he continued his responsibilities outside the household, his wife ensured that the estate remained a place of calm order. Visitors saw a family functioning normally. Servants carried out their duties without tension. The affair gradually faded from conversation because there was nothing dramatic for people to discuss. Over time, even those who once suspected the existence of the relationship lost interest. Other stories replaced it. New events captured attention. The household moved forward. For the wife, this outcome represented a quiet victory. She had protected the dignity of her marriage without creating public conflict. The estate remained stable, and the reputation of the family remained intact. In Tudor society, such victories were rarely celebrated openly. They appeared instead in the calm atmosphere of a household that had survived a moment of danger. Behind that calm stood a woman who understood that maintaining order often required more patience than confrontation. And through her careful management, the story that might have become a scandal quietly faded into silence. The household returned to calm as routines continued and rumours found no space to grow. Through patience and careful explanations, the wife guided the family safely away from scandal. Yet beyond the restored order of the estate, another consequence of the affair was quietly unfolding. Quiet endings often required more than distance. By the time an affair reached its conclusion, those involved understood that silence alone might not be enough to secure peace. Tudor society was built on reputation, but it was also shaped by memory. A person who felt abandoned or humiliated could easily become the source of stories that travelled far beyond the walls of a single household. For this reason, many affairs ended with a practical arrangement designed to prevent resentment. The woman who had once held the attention of a nobleman could not simply disappear without explanation or support. Doing so carried risks. A mistress who suddenly lost financial protection might face hardship. And hardship often brought anger. Anger could easily turn into gossip. In Tudor England, rumours rarely required proof. A story whispered in the right place could damage a family's reputation long after the original relationship had ended. Because of this danger, noble households often chose a quieter solution. Financial support became part of the closing chapter. The husband might provide a modest allowance that allowed the woman to maintain a stable life elsewhere. This payment did not need to be extravagant. Its purpose was simply to prevent immediate hardship and reduce the possibility of resentment. Such arrangements were usually handled discreetly. Money might be transferred through a steward or trusted intermediary, rather than directly. The transaction appeared as a private financial matter, rather than an acknowledgement of a past relationship. In some cases, the arrangement extended beyond money. A small piece of land might be granted in a distant village. This property provided a steady income through rents from tenants. Though modest compared to noble estates, it offered security and independence. Living away from the centre of court, life also created distance between the former mistress and the household she once visited. Distance, in Tudor society, often softened the memory of difficult situations. Another possibility involved arranging a new marriage for the woman. This option served several purposes at once. A respectable marriage provided financial stability and restored the woman's place within ordinary social life. It also redirected attention away from her former connection to the nobleman. Such marriages were not unusual. Families and allies sometimes assisted in finding a suitable match for a woman whose circumstances required careful management. The new husband might be a minor gentleman, a merchant with growing wealth, or a landholder in need of additional connections. The match offered practical benefits for both sides. For the former mistress, it meant security and a fresh beginning. For the noble household, it meant closure. Once married, the woman's loyalty shifted toward her new household. The past relationship lost its relevance, replaced by the responsibilities of a different life. All of these arrangements shared the same goal: prevent scandal before it began. Tudor society valued appearances deeply. A quiet resolution allowed everyone involved to move forward without public humiliation. The wife often understood the importance of this approach. Although she might never express sympathy toward the woman who once threatened her position, she recognized that a controlled outcome protected the reputation of her family. A mistress who felt secure had little reason to speak openly about the past. In this way, financial support and new opportunities served as tools of stability. For the husband, these arrangements also offered reassurance. The affair that once carried excitement had become a potential source of danger. By ensuring that the woman could live comfortably elsewhere, he reduced the chance that the relationship would return as a scandal. Gradually, the connection between them faded into memory. The mistress moved into a different life. The household she once visited continued its routines without her presence. Guests who once noticed the subtle exchanges between them now observed nothing unusual. The affair that once existed within private rooms and secret letters became a quiet story known only to a few. In Tudor society, such endings were often considered successful. No one was publicly disgraced. No dramatic accusations disturbed the household. Life continued, guided by the careful management of reputation. Yet the silence surrounding these arrangements carried its own meaning. Behind the calm surface of noble life stood a network of decisions designed to protect power and prevent scandal. Through money, dishonor, and new beginnings, the past was quietly sealed away, and within that silence, a relationship that once seemed powerful simply vanished from view. A quiet arrangement of money, land, or marriage allowed the former mistress to step away without resentment. Through careful planning, the household avoided the danger of gossip and protected its reputation. And without any public confrontation, a private chapter of Tudor life came to its silent conclusion. Quiet endings often carried more meaning than dramatic punishments in Tudor society. A relationship that had once moved through hidden corridors, exchanged letters in careful secrecy, and existed within whispered conversations could disappear without leaving any visible mark on the public world. When that happened, the silence itself became the sign that control had returned. No official judgment was announced. In other kinds of scandals, particularly those involving politics or accusations of treason, individuals might be summoned before courts or councils. Their actions would be examined, witnesses would speak, and the entire affair would unfold beneath the attention of many observers. But this was not that kind of story. The affair had remained within the boundaries of private life. Because it ended before growing into a public scandal, there was no need for legal punishment or formal investigation. The household handled the matter within its own walls. No judges appeared to question the people involved. No documents recorded accusations. No one stood before the authority to defend or explain their behavior. The absence of such proceedings protected the family from something far more dangerous than guilt: attention. Attention in Tudor society could be destructive. A noble household that became the subject of an official inquiry might find itself discussed in court circles, taverns, and neighbouring estates for months or even years. By avoiding that stage entirely, the family preserved its reputation. At the same time, the ending avoided another dramatic possibility: exile. Stories from Tudor history sometimes describe mistresses who were suddenly expelled from court, forced to leave their social world in disgrace. Such departures rarely remained quiet. Servants noticed hurried packing. Friends whispered about the reasons, and rumours spread quickly through noble networks. A sudden disappearance created questions. In this case, nothing so dramatic occurred. The mistress did not vanish overnight under the shadow of punishment. Instead, her presence faded gradually from the spaces where she had once appeared. Invitations to gatherings became less frequent. Visits to the estate stopped quietly. Conversations that once carried private meaning disappeared into polite formality. Eventually, she simply ceased to appear. For those outside the immediate circle of the household, the change seemed ordinary. Court life was constantly shifting. People arrived. People left. Alliances changed. And attention moved quickly from one story to another. Without a scandal to capture curiosity, the affair slipped into silence. Within the household, however, the outcome was clearly understood. The wife retained her position without public confrontation. She had not demanded punishment or exposed the relationship before relatives or allies. Her strength had appeared through patience and careful control rather than accusation. In Tudor society, this kind of restraint often carried enormous authority. The husband also avoided humiliation. By allowing the relationship to end quietly, he maintained the image of a nobleman who governed both his household and his public life with discipline. His alliances remained intact. His political standing remained stable. The family name continued without the stain of scandal. Daily life resumed its familiar rhythm. Servants moved through corridors carrying candles and letters. Guests arrived for dinners and celebrations. Conversations at the table returned to ordinary matters such as land management, marriage negotiations, and political developments. To anyone observing from outside, the household appeared exactly as it always had. Yet inside that calm routine lay the quiet conclusion of a private conflict, a relationship that had once depended on secrecy. Attention. An opportunity had been carefully removed from the structure of daily life. No announcement marked the change. But everyone close to the situation recognized what had happened. The affair was over, and it ended in the most valuable way Tudor society could imagine, without spectacle. Silence protected every person involved. The wife kept her dignity. The husband kept his reputation. The household preserved its stability. Even the former mistress avoided the public humiliation that the scandal might have brought. For noble families living under constant observation, this outcome represented success. Not every victory required confrontation. Sometimes, the most powerful result appeared when nothing seemed to happen at all. The story ended quietly, leaving behind no courtroom records, no dramatic punishment, and no sudden exile. Only the absence of what had once existed. In Tudor society, that absence often spoke louder than any public declaration. No trial had been held. No exile had been ordered. And the household continued its life without interruption. Through patience and careful silence, a dangerous relationship had been guided to its end. Yet, even when the scandal disappears, the consequences of such quiet endings rarely vanish as completely as they first appear. Children in Tudor noble families rarely stood at the center of public attention. Yet their future shaped nearly every important decision inside the household. Marriage alliances, estate management, and family reputation were all built with the next generation in mind. Because of this, the quiet ending of an affair carried consequences that reached far beyond the relationship between husband and wife. The first and most immediate result concerned family honor. In Tudor society, honor was not simply a personal quality. It was a collective reputation that surrounded an entire lineage. The actions of one member of the household could influence how others judged the family as a whole. Children grew up in the shadow of that reputation. When a scandal became public, its effects often extended to sons and daughters who had played no part in the original events. People remembered the story long after it had ended. Years later, when marriage negotiations began, whispers about the past could still influence decisions. Because of this, preserving honor meant protecting the future of the children. The quiet resolution of the affair allowed the family to avoid the kind of scandal that might follow the children into adulthood. Without dramatic accusations or public humiliation, the story never gained the strength needed to spread widely. Neighbors, allies, and distant relatives continued to see the household as stable. For the children growing up inside that environment, life appeared normal. Their family name remained respected. No rumors followed them into gatherings or social events. Honor remained intact. Another crucial consequence involved inheritance. Tudor noble families lived under legal systems that placed enormous importance on legitimacy. Land, titles, and wealth usually passed through lawful marriage to recognized heirs. The structure of inheritance relied heavily on clear family lines. An uncontrolled scandal involving a mistress could threaten that clarity. If rumors suggested that a nobleman favored an illegitimate child or intended to divide his estate unfairly, conflict might arise among relatives and legal authorities. Even suspicion could create tension between branches of the family. The quiet end of the affair prevented such uncertainty. By restoring the stability of the marriage, the husband reaffirmed the position of his legitimate children as rightful heirs. Their claim to the family estate remained unquestioned. Documents, wills, and inheritance plans continued to reflect the traditional order expected in Tudor society. For the eldest son in particular, this stability mattered greatly. As the future head of the household, he depended on the clarity of his position. A family divided by scandal might weaken his authority long before he inherited the estate. The silent resolution, therefore, protected the legal and social framework surrounding his future. Daughters also benefited from the preservation of their reputation. Marriage negotiations for noble daughters often depended heavily on the perceived stability of their families. Prospective husbands and their relatives examined not only wealth and land, but also the reputation of the household. A scandal involving the father might raise doubts about the reliability of the family. By avoiding public disgrace, the household ensured that daughters entered marriage negotiations without the burden of such suspicion. Allies continued to view the family as trustworthy partners in future alliances. Beyond reputation and inheritance, the quiet ending of the affair also preserved the emotional structure of the household. Children living within noble estates observed the behavior of their parents carefully. Even when they did not fully understand the details of adult relationships, they sensed changes in the atmosphere. Loud conflicts or public accusations could create anxiety within the household. Servants might speak more cautiously. Guests might behave awkwardly. The tension would be difficult to hide. When the affair ended quietly, those disruptions never reached the children directly. Daily life continued as before. Meals were shared in the great hall. Lessons with tutors proceeded without interruption. Celebrations and seasonal gatherings followed their familiar patterns. To the children growing up inside the estate, their family appeared stable and secure. The wife played an important role in maintaining this environment. By managing the household calmly and avoiding open confrontation, she ensured that the younger members of the family remained sheltered from the crisis that had briefly threatened the household. Her patience preserved the sense of continuity that noble families valued deeply. Over time, the affair faded into the background of memory. The mistress disappeared from social gatherings. Conversations shifted toward new events and alliances. The household continued its ordinary rhythm. The children inherited not the scandal of their parents' difficulties, but the stability that followed. Years later, when they stepped into their own roles as heirs, husbands, wives, and managers of estates, the quiet resolution of that earlier conflict continued to benefit them. The family name remained respected, the estate remained united, and the structure of inheritance remained clear. In Tudor society, these outcomes represented the true measure of success. A marriage that survived without public disgrace did more than protect the couple involved. It safeguarded the future of the entire family. Through silence, patience, and careful management, the household ensured that the next generation would inherit not scandal but stability. The quiet ending of the affair preserved the honor of the family and protected the future of its children. Inheritance remained clear. Alliances remained possible, and the household continued its steady rhythm. Beyond that restored stability, the woman who once stood outside the marriage faced a future shaped by distance and uncertainty. For the woman who once stood closest to the center of the affair, the quiet ending carried consequences that unfolded slowly and often painfully. While the household regained its stability and the family reputation remained protected, her position within Tudor society began to change in ways that were difficult to reverse. The first loss was social standing. During the height of the relationship, a mistress connected to a powerful nobleman often enjoyed a subtle but noticeable form of influence. Her presence at gatherings attracted attention. Invitations arrived more easily. Conversations with other guests carried a certain curiosity, because everyone understood that she moved near the center of private power. Although her position was unofficial, it still carried weight. People spoke politely to her. Servants treated her with careful respect. At court gatherings or estate dinners, she herself seated among individuals who wished to remain close to the influence surrounding the nobleman. This delicate social position depended entirely on one condition: the continuation of the relationship. Once the affair ended, that invisible support disappeared. The same people who had once welcomed her presence began to behave differently. Their greetings remained polite, but the warmth behind them faded. Conversations grew shorter. Invitations that once arrived regularly began to disappear. No one announced the change directly. Tudor society rarely explained such shifts openly. Instead, the woman simply noticed that the spaces she once entered easily no longer opened to her. This loss of social position could be deeply isolating, without the connection that once defined her presence. She no longer occupied a meaningful role within the court's network of influence. New favourites appeared. New alliances formed. Attention moved elsewhere. Gradually, she became a figure from an earlier chapter of court life. The second consequence often involved physical distance from the places where the relationship had once flourished. Court life in Tudor England was a crowded and competitive environment. Nobles, courtiers, merchants, and servants moved constantly through its halls. Reputation travelled quickly through these circles, and people were careful about the company they kept. When an affair ended quietly, the most practical solution was often for the mistress to leave that environment. Remaining close to the court could invite uncomfortable questions. Curious observers might notice the absence of her former companion. Old rumours might return to conversation. Distance reduced those risks. The woman might move to a smaller residence outside the centre of court life. Sometimes, she returned to relatives in another region. In other cases, she settled in a modest estate granted during the final arrangements of the affair. Wherever she went, the change in environment was unmistakable. The lively gatherings, political conversations, and constant movement of court life were replaced by quieter surroundings. Days passed with fewer visitors and fewer opportunities for influence. For someone who had once lived near the heart of power, this transition could feel like a slow disappearance. Yet the most uncertain part of her future often involved financial security. During the relationship, the nobleman's attention might have brought gifts, comfortable living arrangements, or access to wealth that would otherwise have remained beyond her reach. When the affair ended, that support could not simply vanish overnight. A noble household often arranged some form of financial assistance to ensure that the woman could continue her life without immediate hardship. This support might appear as a yearly allowance, a modest property, or assistance through trusted intermediaries. Such arrangements offered stability, but they also created a new dependence. Her future now rested partly on the continuation of that support. If circumstances changed, if the nobleman died, lost influence, or redirected his resources, her security could quickly weaken. Unlike the wife, whose position was protected by law and marriage, the former mistress stood outside the formal structures that guaranteed long-term protection. Her situation, therefore, remained fragile. Some women attempted to rebuild their social lives through marriage to another man willing to accept their past quietly. Others lived independently on the resources provided during the settlement. In either case, the life that followed was rarely identical to the one that had existed during the affair. Court life moved on quickly. New alliances captured attention. New relationships became the subject of whispered conversation. The woman who had once drawn curiosity and speculation gradually disappeared from the centre of these stories. Only a few individuals remembered the earlier connection clearly. Time created distance where secrecy once existed. For the household she left behind, the affair had ended successfully. Reputation remained intact. Children inherited a stable family name, and daily routines continued without disruption. For the former mistress, however, the ending marked the beginning of a different life. One shaped by caution, distance, and the quiet memory of a chapter that could never return. Her story did not end in public disgrace. There were no accusations shouted across halls, no dramatic exile announced before a crowd. Instead, she faded from the spaces where she had once been noticed. In Tudor society, such disappearances were common. Power moved quickly. Attention shifted easily, and those who once stood near influence often found themselves watching it from a distance. The relationship had vanished without scandal, exactly as the household intended. But the silence that protected the family also ensured that the woman who once stood outside the marriage would carry the quiet consequences alone. Her social standing faded as invitations stopped and court life continued without her presence. Distance from the household marked the end of the influence she once held, and in the quiet years that followed, the memory of that vanished connection would shape every choice she made afterward. Power inside a Tudor marriage rarely appeared in loud declarations. It did not usually arrive through anger, raised voices, or dramatic confrontations in the Great Hall. Instead, the authority of a noble wife often revealed itself through something quieter and far more enduring: control over time, patience, and the legal structure that surrounded the marriage. The first lesson that emerged from these quiet endings was simple: power did not require noise. A wife who shouted accusations or publicly exposed her husband's affair risked damaging her own position as much as his. Tudor society expected noblewomen to represent dignity and restraint. A woman who lost control in public could easily become the subject of the same gossip she wished to avoid. Because of this expectation, the most effective wives rarely relied on open confrontation. They understood that influence inside the household often came from a calm presence rather than dramatic action. By maintaining composure, they preserved the image of stability that society associated with legitimate marriage. Guests entering the estate saw a woman who continued her duties without visible distress. Servants observed that the routines of the household remained unchanged. Relatives visiting the family found no public signs of conflict. This outward calm carried a powerful message. It suggested that the wife remained firmly in control of her position. Her authority did not depend on emotional reactions. Instead, it rested on the social structure that recognized her as the rightful center of the household. Another lesson lay in patience. Time often worked in the wife's favor. Affairs that seemed intense in their early stages rarely maintained the same energy forever. Political responsibilities, family obligations, and simple familiarity gradually weakened the excitement that had once surrounded the relationship. A wife who waited carefully could allow this natural change to unfold. Rather than reacting immediately, she observed the shifting patterns inside the household. She noticed when visits from the mistress became less frequent. She saw when the husband's attention turned back toward family matters. At that moment, quiet action became possible. Patience allowed her to guide the situation without forcing confrontation. Invitations changed. Social alliances shifted. And conversations about family responsibilities grew more frequent. Gradually, the relationship outside the marriage lost the space it once occupied. This strategy required discipline. Waiting calmly, while others whispered about the affair, demanded emotional strength. Yet Tudor wives understood that endurance often produced better results than sudden reaction. By the time the affair weakened, the wife already stood ready to restore order. The third lesson involved the legal structure surrounding marriage. Tudor law strongly favored legitimate unions. Property rights, inheritance rules, and social authority all flowed through lawful marriage. A wife, therefore, possessed protections that a mistress could never fully claim. The household itself recognized these protections. Servants answered first to the lawful mistress of the estate. Relatives maintained alliances through the marriage that connected their families. Legal documents defining property and inheritance confirmed her central role within the household. Even when an affair created a temporary imbalance, these structures remained in place. A mistress might attract attention, gifts, or affection, yet she existed outside the framework that guaranteed long-term power. The wife understood this advantage clearly. Rather than competing with the mistress for emotional attention, she relied on the institutions that supported her position. Church law recognized the marriage. Property law reinforced her role within the estate. Social expectations encouraged stability rather than scandal. Over time, these forces naturally favored the lawful household. When the affair eventually faded, the wife's authority appeared almost unchanged. The estate continued to function under her management, Guests continued to recognize her as the central figure of the household. Her victory remained quiet, but unmistakable. Tudor society rarely celebrated such outcomes publicly. There were no speeches announcing the restoration of order, no ceremonies marking the end of the affair. Instead, life continued exactly as before. The household remained stable. The marriage endured. The reputation of the family survived without visible damage. For observers looking carefully at these events, an important lesson emerged. Power inside Tudor marriage did not always appear through direct struggle. Often, it revealed itself through patience, restraint, and an understanding of the legal structures that shaped society. The wife who remained calm, while others expected anger, demonstrated a deeper kind of authority. She allowed time, law, and social expectation to work together on her behalf. By the moment the affair disappeared, she had not needed to shout, accuse, or demand. The structure of Tudor society had already ensured the outcome. In that quiet resolution lay the true strength of her position. Power inside the Tudor household appeared not through confrontation but through patience and careful control. Marriage, law, and social order quietly supported the wife's position while the affair slowly faded. Through that calm endurance, the balance of authority within the household returned to where it had always belonged. Quiet change often shaped Tudor households more deeply than dramatic conflict. From the outside, the estate might appear exactly as it always had. Guests still arrived at the gates. Servants continued their routines. And long tables in the great hall filled with conversation during evening meals. Nothing seemed broken. Nothing appeared to have ended. Yet beneath that calm surface, the balance of power inside the household had already shifted. Unlike the violent struggles often described in political history, this transformation left no visible traces of conflict. No arguments were echoing through stone corridors. No public accusations that forced people to take sides. The marriage remained intact before the eyes of society. Because of this restraint, no blood had been spilled. Tudor society was certainly capable of brutality when conflicts became public. Political rivalries sometimes led to imprisonment, confiscated estates, or even execution. When accusations grew severe enough, courts and councils could transform private disputes into dramatic spectacles. But within many noble households, family matters were handled differently. A wife who understood the risks of scandal rarely sought open revenge. Public punishment would not restore stability. Instead, it would invite curiosity and encourage rumors that might travel far beyond the estate. Silence offered a safer path. Without confrontation, there was nothing for observers to repeat. Servants continued their work as if nothing unusual had occurred. Visitors noticed no tension during dinners or gatherings. The household maintained the image of calm discipline expected from noble families. In this way, the story avoided becoming a scandal. Scandals required witnesses, accusation, and dramatic moments that captured attention. Without those elements, even a serious affair could dissolve quietly. The mistress simply stopped appearing at gatherings. Letters ceased to arrive. Conversations that once carried hidden meaning faded into polite distance. People outside the household might notice the absence, but they rarely understand its full significance. Court life moved quickly. New alliances formed. New rivalries appeared, and fresh rumors replaced older ones. Without a public conflict to anchor the story, the affair gradually disappeared from conversation. Inside the household, however, the change was unmistakable. The wife's calm authority had reshaped the environment. Through patience, careful management of social routines, and quiet reliance on law and tradition, she had restored stability without creating chaos. Her influence did not arrive through dramatic action. It appeared in the absence of conflict. Servants once again looked to her as the steady center of the estate. Guests visiting the household encountered the familiar structure of noble life. a lawful marriage, a well-ordered family, and a household functioning with discipline. The husband, too, adjusted his position within that restored structure. The excitement that once surrounded the affair had been replaced by the responsibilities of family, property, and reputation. His role returned fully to the duties expected of a Tudor nobleman. Political alliances remained secure. Social connections continued without interruption. From the perspective of the outside world, nothing remarkable had happened. Yet the balance of authority had quietly changed. The mistress no longer stood within the spaces where influence once touched her life. The household that had once allowed her presence now moved forward without acknowledging her role in its past. The wife remained. Her position had not required public victory or humiliation of her rival. Instead, she had relied on the quiet forces that Tudor society placed on her side: law, reputation, family structure, and time. These forces worked slowly but decisively. The affair faded. The household stabilized. The public image of the family remained untouched. Such outcomes rarely appeared dramatic enough to enter official histories. Chroniclers preferred stories filled with battles, executions, or spectacular betrayals. Yet within the private world of Tudor marriages, victories like this carried enormous importance. They protected estates from division. They preserved alliances between families. Most importantly, they ensured that the next generation inherited a household free from scandal. The greatest strength of this resolution lay in its invisibility. No celebration marked the moment when the balance of power returned to the wife. No announcement confirmed that the affair had ended. The change simply existed within the quiet rhythm of daily life. Servants lit candles in the evening. Guests continued to arrive for dinners. Conversations flowed through the halls exactly as they always had. But within that calm routine, something fundamental had shifted. The household had passed through a dangerous moment without losing its dignity, and the victory belonged not to the loudest voice, but to the quiet endurance that had guided the story from beginning to end. No blood had been spilled, and no scandal had shaken the household. Life within the estate continued, with the same calm order visible to every visitor. Somewhere within that calm routine, however, the balance of power had quietly changed forever. Not every Tudor affair ended in quiet distance. While some households resolved their conflicts through patience and silence, others allowed emotions, pride, or political pressure to turn private relationships into public disasters. These uncontrolled scandals revealed what could happen when discretion disappeared and reputation collapsed under the weight of attention. The contrast between these two outcomes made the strategy of silence easier to understand. In some cases, the presence of a mistress became impossible to ignore. Her influence grew too visible, her access to the nobleman too obvious, and the whispers surrounding the relationship too loud to remain contained within the household. Once that threshold was crossed, events often moved quickly. Families, advisors, and political allies began to intervene. The nobleman might be pressured to remove the woman from court entirely. Instead of quiet distance, the mistress faced sudden exile. Exile rarely occurred gently. A woman who had once appeared regularly in court gatherings might be ordered to leave the city within days. Her belongings were packed hurriedly, sometimes under the watch of servants who now treated her with a different tone. Friends who had once welcomed her presence often withdrew their support immediately. The reason for this reaction was simple. Public scandal made the association dangerous. Anyone who remained too close to the disgraced figure risked becoming part of the story themselves. As a result, the woman found herself isolated far more abruptly than those whose affairs ended quietly. Some mistresses attempted to defend themselves through letters or appeals to powerful patrons. Others simply disappeared into distant towns or estates, hoping that time would soften the memory of their fall. Their stories, however, often continued circulating long after their departure. Court life thrived on dramatic narratives. A scandal involving a powerful family could become the subject of endless conversation in halls, taverns, and marketplaces. Servants repeated fragments of overheard arguments. Courtiers shared rumors about accusations and betrayals. Each retelling exaggerated the details. For the noble household, at the center of the story, the consequences could be severe. A public scandal rarely damaged only the mistress. The family itself might become divided, as relatives argued about responsibility and reputation. Some supported the husband, while others blamed him for disgracing the household. These disagreements sometimes reached the level of legal disputes. Property arrangements could be questioned. Inheritance plans might become uncertain if the conflict exposes hidden tensions within the family. What began as a private affair could evolve into a wider crisis involving land, alliances, and political standing. Children growing up inside such households felt the effects most deeply. When the scandal spread openly, the family name carried the shadow of that story into future generations. Marriage negotiations for sons and daughters became more complicated as other families hesitated to attach themselves to a household known for disorder. Even loyal allies might step back quietly, waiting for the storm to pass. The emotional atmosphere within the estate also changed dramatically. Servants whispered about arguments. Guests sensed tension during gatherings. The calm order expected from noble life disappeared. Once conflict reached this stage, restoring stability became extremely difficult. Compared with these dramatic outcomes, the strategy of silence, followed by some Tudor wives, appears remarkably deliberate. Rather than exposing the affair publicly, they contained it within the household. Instead of forcing the mistress into sudden exile, they allowed her presence to fade gradually through reduced invitations and quiet financial arrangements. The difference between these two approaches shaped the future of the family. In the quiet strategy, the mistress left without spectacle. The husband avoided humiliation. The wife preserved her dignity while restoring order inside the estate. Most importantly, the family name remained protected. Guests visiting the household saw no visible conflict. Political allies continued their relationships without hesitation. Children grew up without the burden of a widely known scandal attached to their parents. The absence of drama prevented the story from spreading beyond its original boundaries. This contrast reveals why silence became such a powerful tool in Tudor society. Public confrontation might satisfy immediate anger, but it often creates consequences that last for years. Quiet management, by contrast, allowed a household to absorb the crisis and continue forward almost unchanged. To outsiders, the estate appeared stable. To those who understood what had happened, the resolution represented careful control rather than passive acceptance. The wife had not ignored the affair. She had guided its ending in a way that avoided the destructive path seen in many other scandals. In Tudor life, this difference mattered enormously. A scandal remembered for decades could begin with a single, uncontrolled moment. A quiet ending, however, left nothing dramatic for history to record. The story faded before it could become legend. Some households allowed affairs to explode into scandal, exile, and lasting damage to the family name. Others resolved the same crisis through patience and silence, leaving almost no visible trace behind. In Tudor society, the difference between these two paths often determined whether a family survived a crisis or became a story told for generations. The quiet management of a fading affair often left consequences that extended far beyond the moment of resolution. In Tudor society, the true importance of such restraint did not lie only in ending the relationship itself. Its deeper significance appeared in what happened afterward. In the years that followed, as the household continued its life without the shadow of scandal, one of the most important results involved the preservation of family property. Noble families in Tudor England existed within a complex structure of land ownership and inheritance. Estates were rarely simple possessions. They represented generations of accumulated wealth. alliances between families, and legal arrangements designed to protect those holdings from division or dispute. Any public scandal involving the head of the household could place that structure at risk. If an affair turned into a widely known conflict, relatives might question the nobleman's judgment or loyalty to the family's interests. Political rivals could use the situation to weaken his standing at court. In extreme cases, disputes over property or inheritance might arise if the scandal created uncertainty about the future of the estate. Quiet resolution prevented such dangers from emerging. Because the affair ended without dramatic confrontation, the estate remained stable. Legal documents governing land ownership continued unchanged. Tenants, stewards, and local allies saw no disruption in the authority of the household. The land remained under the control of the family exactly as it had before. This stability allowed the estate to pass smoothly to the next generation when the time came. Another long-term effect involved the strengthened position of the wife within the household. During the period of the affair, her authority may have appeared briefly challenged. Attention shifted toward the mistress, and some members of the household might have wondered how the situation would develop when the relationship ended quietly. However, the outcome reinforced the wife's central role. She remained the lawful mistress of the estate, the figure recognized by both church and society as the true partner in the marriage. Servants continued to answer to her management of the household. Guests visiting the estate interacted with her as the visible center of family life. Her patience had protected the family without causing public conflict. Over time, this calm authority became part of the household's identity. The wife was remembered not as someone defeated by scandal, but as the person who preserved order when the family faced a moment of danger. In Tudor society, such quiet strength often carried lasting respect. The husband also benefited from the controlled ending of the affair. Public scandals could easily destroy a nobleman's career. Court life depended heavily on reputation. A man known for reckless behavior or public humiliation might lose the confidence of political allies. Once that trust weakened, his influence at court could disappear quickly. By allowing the affair to fade quietly, the husband avoided this outcome. He remained known as a nobleman, capable of managing his household and responsibilities. His alliances with other families continued without interruption. Invitations to political gatherings and court events remained open. In the public world, his reputation appeared largely unchanged. This preservation of reputation allowed him to continue participating in the political and social life that defined Tudor nobility. Over the years, the affair itself slowly disappeared from memory. New events replaced old stories. Political struggles, marriages, births, and deaths created new subjects for conversation. Without a scandal to anchor it in public attention, the relationship became a private chapter known only to a small circle of people. The household moved forward. Children grew into adulthood. Estates expanded or changed through marriage alliances. The family name continued its place within the social structure of Tudor England. Looking back across time, the quiet management of the affair revealed its deeper significance. The wife had protected the household from scandal. The husband had preserved his political standing. The estate remained intact, ready to pass to the next generation. What could have become a destructive public crisis, instead, faded into a brief disturbance within the long life of the family. Such outcomes rarely appeared dramatic enough to attract chroniclers or historians. Yet within the daily reality of Tudor noble life, they represented an important form of success. Families survived not only through strength or wealth, but also through careful control of reputation. The quiet discipline that ended the affair allowed the household to continue its story without interruption. Years later, few people remembered the moment when the balance of the household had briefly been threatened. They saw only the stability that remained. And in Tudor society, that stability became the true legacy of a crisis handled with patience and restraint. The family kept its land, its reputation, and the stability that allowed the next generation to inherit without dispute. Through patience and careful control, the wife strengthened her position while the husband avoided public collapse. Yet even after the household returned to calm, the final meaning of this quiet victory still waited to be understood. Desire in Tudor society often appeared powerful in the moment. It could change the atmosphere of a household, alter the rhythm of conversations, and create the illusion that a private relationship held enormous influence. A nobleman might spend months or even years caught within that excitement, believing the connection to be important or even permanent. Yet time rarely treated such passions kindly. What once felt urgent gradually weakened under the weight of responsibility, reputation, and routine. Political obligations demanded attention. Family matters required careful management. Estates needed supervision. Slowly, the intensity that once surrounded the affair faded into something quieter and far less certain. Desire, in many cases, proved temporary. Marriage, however, remained. In Tudor England, marriage was not simply a relationship between two individuals. It was a structure built from law, religion, inheritance, and family alliances. That structure connected generations and anchored the stability of noble households. Even when personal feelings shifted, the framework surrounding marriage remained in place. The lawful wife stood at the center of that framework. Her position was protected by the church, recognized by law, and reinforced by the expectations of society. While a mistress might capture attention for a time, she existed outside the system that guaranteed long-term authority. This difference defined the outcome of many quiet endings. As the affair weakened, the marriage endured. Servants continued to answer to the wife as the mistress of the household. Relatives continued to recognize her as the partner through whom alliances and inheritance were secured. Her authority did not depend on passion. It depended on permanence. The husband, too, eventually returned to the structure that defined his responsibilities. The excitement that once drew him away from the household became less important than the duties attached to his position. Land requires management. Political alliances required attention. The future of his children required careful planning. These responsibilities did not fade with time. They only grew stronger. Within that reality, the affair lost its power. The mistress, who once seemed central to the story, gradually moved beyond the household's daily life. Her presence disappeared from gatherings and conversations. The relationship that had once attracted attention quietly dissolved. No announcement declared the ending. Instead, the absence of the affair slowly replaced its earlier intensity. This quiet disappearance reveals something important about Tudor society. Power did not always appear through open confrontation or dramatic punishment. Sometimes it emerged through silence. Silence controlled the flow of information. Silence prevented gossip from spreading beyond the walls of the estate. Silence allowed a dangerous situation to resolve itself without destroying the reputation of those involved. For the wife, silence became a form of authority. She did not need to accuse the mistress publicly. She did not need to demand dramatic gestures of apology from her husband. Instead, she allowed time, law, and social expectation to guide the household back towards stability. Her strength appeared through restraint. In many ways, that restraint became the strongest form of punishment available within Tudor society. A mistress who had once moved through the estate with confidence suddenly found herself outside its routines. Invitations stopped arriving. Conversations ended politely, but quickly. The household that once welcomed her presence continued its life without her. No public disgrace marked the change. Yet the distance carried a clear meaning. Silence closed the story more completely than anger ever could. For the household itself, the outcome represented success. The family name remained respected. The estate continued to function under stable authority. Children grew into adulthood without the burden of scandal attached to their parents' marriage. Visitors entering the estate saw only what Tudor society expected to see: a lawful household, a respected family, and a marriage that continued to stand. The brief disturbance created by the affair faded into the background of memory. Years later, few people would remember the details of the story. They would remember only the stability that followed. And within that stability lay the final lesson. Desire may ignite quickly, drawing attention and curiosity for a short time. Yet structures built on law, inheritance, and reputation often outlast those moments of passion. Marriage endured. Authority returned to its familiar centre. The household moved forward, as if the affair had been nothing more than a passing shadow across its long history. Thank you for spending this quiet time exploring a small corner of Tudor life. These stories remind us that history is not only made of battles and crowns, but also of the quiet choices people make to protect their families, their names, and their futures. As this story comes to a gentle close, the great halls of Tudor estates grow still once again. Candles burn low along stone walls. Servants move softly through empty corridors, and the household settles into the calm rhythm of the night. May your evening be peaceful, and may the echoes of history drift slowly into rest. Good night, and sleep well.